Let's talk about the one thing I really did like in the first episode of Amazon's House of David. Hi, my name is Aaron. I'm a biblical scholar, and I help you read the Bible better. And this thing I'm going to talk about today is technically an unbiblical change. It's not something that you'll find in the Bible specifically, but it's a kind of unbiblical change I can really appreciate because it's a change that highlights something that is in the Bible that's nevertheless really easy to pass over with a casual read. And those are the kind of changes that make the text more interesting because you see the show, you go, I don't remember that. You go back to check the text and you say to yourself, wow, something like this really is in there and I hadn't noticed before. And this change comes in the form of a couple lines of added dialogue to the ultimate confrontation between the prophet Samuel and King Saul. Now, much of this conversation plays out exactly as it does in the Bible. In fact, several lines of dialogue are taken directly from verses towards the end of 1 Samuel chapter 15. Now, in this part of the story, Saul has just failed to sufficiently annihilate the Amalekites that he was commanded to destroy. And Samuel appears first in public and then in private to condemn him for this, and ultimately to say that the kingdom is going to go to somebody else besides him. This is, of course, David. And Saul is abashed by this and begs and pleads and looks quite pathetic in both the biblical narrative and at the end of this scene. But before that, in the TV show, Saul and Samuel say a couple things that they don't in the Bible, and it is absolutely delicious. It actually made me smile. And this is the first time I've smiled at faith-based programming in like 30 years since I watched VeggieTales as a young child. So that's a pretty impressive thing to pull off. The first bit of added dialogue comes at a very emotional moment in the conversation when Samuel says to Saul, "I loved you like a son," and Saul says back, "But your sons never loved you." Now, you may be thinking, who are Samuel's sons? I don't remember ever hearing about them before. Why don't they love Samuel? What's going on here? And you can be totally forgiven for not knowing anything about Samuel's sons. I published a book on 1st and 2nd Samuel, and I don't remember Samuel's sons' names. But you may remember the event attached to them, and that's at the beginning of 1 Samuel chapter 8. What Saul brings up in this conversation, and this is true to the biblical narrative, is that a big reason why ancient Israel had a king at all was because of a kind of succession crisis triggered by the fact that Samuel's sons turned out to be terrible people, and everybody in the land knew it, and they didn't trust these people to lead after Samuel died. Now, Samuel is remembered as a prophet, and that's true, but he was also a judge, and therefore the de facto ruler of ancient Israel prior to Saul's ascension to the throne. So it'd be very natural for the elders of Israel to assume that upon Samuel's death, one of his sons would take over leadership of the country. But as 1 Samuel chapter 8 reveals, they couldn't trust his sons, and in a sense, this amounts to a rejection of Samuel too, because of course, he is their father. Whatever virtues Samuel has, he wasn't capable of producing morally viable heirs. And there's a real possibility that Samuel wasn't a very good father. And why would I say that? Well, where did Samuel learn to be a father? Who was his father? Well, his father was Elkanah, but who actually raised him? Eli. And what was the problem with Eli's sons? Well, they exploited the poor, and they sexually assaulted women in the sanctuary. So Eli doesn't seem to have been a very good father either. His sons turned out bad as well. That's the environment that Samuel grew up in, and his sons turned out bad also. And it's because Samuel's sons turned out to be bad that the elders of Israel gather together in 1 Samuel chapter 8 and demand to have a king placed over us. And therefore, it's really Samuel's failures as a father for why Saul comes to replace him as a leader over the country. Every time Samuel looks at Saul, he sees his own failure reflected in his eyes. And that's a very easy emotional dynamic to forget when we're sort of just casually reading through this text. A second very interesting bit of added dialogue also given to Saul comes when Saul wonders whether or not the things that Samuel is saying are coming from him, the man, or the God that he's supposed to represent. Now, as casual Bible readers, we probably just assume that if Samuel, the prophet, says that God says X, Y, and Z, that at some point it's safe to assume that God actually said X, Y, and Z. Or is it? Is that really safe to assume? And when we actually go back and look closely at the text, where the voice of God stops and the voice of Samuel begins is far more ambiguous than you might have assumed it to be in a casual read. If you go back to 1 Samuel 13, for example, this is the first time that Samuel publicly condemns Saul and tells him that he's going to lose the kingdom. Saul shows up on the eve of a battle. He was told many years ago in narrative time that he's supposed to wait 7 days for Samuel to arrive. Samuel will then offer a sacrifice blessing the battle to come. Well, Saul arrives. He waits 7 days. Samuel does not show up to perform the sacrifice. The morale of his troops is crippled. So he goes on and performs the sacrifice himself in order to keep up morale. And then Samuel sort of jumps out of the bushes as though he had been hiding right there, waiting this whole time just for Saul to do this. And Samuel condemns Saul for breaking God's commands. But throughout this entire scene, this whole chapter, really, we never actually see God say anything to Samuel. We sort of just have to take his word for it that he's speaking on God's behalf. Samuel condemns Saul for breaking God's commands. Which commands? God never commanded Saul to wait 7 days, this arbitrary amount of time. Don't offer sacrifices before them on these particular conditions. This is not a command you find anywhere in the text. It was relayed off page, if it was relayed at all. But it kind of seems like Samuel's just making it up. This is also kind of true for 1 Samuel 15, which is the second occasion where Samuel publicly condemns Saul. In this instance, Samuel shows up, apropos of nothing, and says that God commands Saul to go annihilate the Amalekites. We don't hear from God initially. You actually have to read down a little ways before we actually get to a verse that tells us what God is saying. And God's actual statements are quite vague. God says, well, I'm very disappointed with Saul. I regret that I made him king because he broke my commands. But the text doesn't specify which commands those are that Saul was supposed to have broken, nor does it specify particular consequences or a way that Samuel is supposed to go about delivering those consequences to Saul. Samuel sort of just makes up that part by himself, and then it's after that that he then goes and, in his own words, condemns Saul for what he does and tells him that he's going to lose the kingdom as a result. So when we pay close attention to the biblical narrative, there are actually a lot of unresolved questions about what specific information Samuel is supposed to be receiving from God, and what parts of this Samuel is kind of making up on the fly himself. Saul's suspicions are entirely reasonable. Samuel could be making up big parts of this, and we'd have no idea as a reader of these narratives or as a character in the actual story itself. Now, why would Samuel make up something like this? Well, the conversation kind of gets at that. At one point, Saul says, is this the word of God, or is this just the ramblings of a jealous man? That's pretty on point. Again, Samuel used to be the leader of this country and had to cede that power to Saul after his failure to produce morally viable heirs. So Saul is taking over for him, but Samuel's sort of lingering in the background, no longer in power, having to watch somebody else lead the country in his place. Samuel does kind of seem like a figure who's desperately clinging to what amount of power he still has, still attempting to meddle, still attempting to make sure that, everything turns out in the way he wants. He does kind of seem jealous in these stories if you read the text closely. All this to say, I think these are some great changes. I think they prompt us to go back to the biblical narrative and read them a little bit more closely with some different questions in mind. And of course, that's like the essence of interpretation. That's where the text comes alive in the face of new questions that we bring to it.